There needs to be enough food this time. Of all the things that the high schoolers at my Michigan church told us as we helped them prepare for our youth pilgrimages, this was the one that probably surprised me the most. There needs to be enough food this time. The person who said it had been on our previous pilgrimage, and I couldn't remember a time on our last pilgrimage when we had run out of food. In fact, we'd brought home leftovers. But I asked around and I learned that all the guys had been hungry pretty much all day, every day that we'd hiked in the Rockies. So, really? Why? Why didn't we know about it? We asked. Well, there wasn't any lunch meat, and Molly said she wouldn't buy any, so we were just always hungry. Now, this was true enough. The previous trip, before that, all the pilgrims were scared their lunch meat would go bad in the heat before they ate it, so we'd mostly thrown lunch meat away. And Molly refused to buy meat if people weren't going to eat it. But it was also true enough that there had been lots of other things to eat besides lunch meat, but people had chosen not to eat the food they didn't prefer. So there was some disagreement over whether there had indeed been enough food. Enough is, I think, often a tricky word. I wonder, what does enough mean to you? You're welcome to share answers in chat if you want. Is it sometimes enough as a sigh of completion? Or is it enough, a cry of frustration? Or is enough a muddy middle ground for you, as it was for my grandmother, who learned as a teen and young adult during the Great Depression to let cardboard shoe inserts and one meal a day be enough, but could never trust as an old woman that the money she and her husband had saved would indeed be enough to cover her comfortable living expenses, even if she had had to live in skilled nursing for 30 years, and was therefore enough for her to know she was secure. How much would that sense of security have cost, I wonder? How much would have been enough for that? How much would it have taken to give Naomi and Ruth so much security that they could pretend their good fortune was guaranteed? I need to make sure you are provided for, Naomi tells Ruth in today's story in our paraphrased summary version of the whole book. In more direct translations, it's often, I need to seek some security for you. Either way, the heart of it is, I want to know that you are going to have enough, not just today, but for the long term. And as the book of Ruth ends, they do indeed seem to live happily ever after. And Ruth and Naomi even get to become ancestors of the greatest kings of Israel. As enough goes, they seem to have done about as well as they possibly could have. And yet, was the birth of a new baby enough, I wonder, for them to push aside the recognition that nothing is promised to tomorrow? Did they trust the security of a marriage, a farm, and a bloodline, even at the end of the story? Or did they spend the rest of their lives holding on for dear life, waiting for another shoe to drop? It's hard to trust enough, precisely because scarcity does exist. It's undeniably real. And whether it's at the level of basic needs like food and shelter, or higher needs like companionship and opportunity, I expect that each of us has known scarcity in our lives in some way. I would have expected it even before COVID, but I think COVID has highlighted for us this reality that scarcity exists and is painful. Isolation, supply chain disruption, the uncertainty of what precaution is enough. These very present questions have, I think, changed even those of us who have always gotten to think of ourselves as having enough. And they will always be real in the sense that nothing will make them not have happened. And nothing can guarantee for us any more than for Naomi or my grandmother that enough today will automatically mean enough for tomorrow. So if the idea of trusting in enough sounds like pie in the sky, I understand. Certainly, just preaching about enoughness doesn't put food on the table or pay the water bill. It will not put an end to violence and war, It's not a quick fix to problems in our nation or our world. It will not prevent wildfires. It will not eradicate COVID. Enough is not magic, but it is real. I remember a Bible study years ago when I was a campus ministry intern about the rich young man we heard about a few weeks ago, the one whom Jesus told to give away all he owned. And a friend said in that study, the idea of giving away everything I own sounds nice in theory, but ridiculous in practice. If I cut up all my credit cards and gave up my scholarship, I'd be dead in a week. And I remember the chaplain said, no, you wouldn't, because we wouldn't let you be. So long as this community still had resources to share, you'd be okay. The point was not to give up and stop participating in the world any more than it was to hoard all the riches for her own personal security, but to tie her security to that of her community. It's not a lot easier to imagine, I think, than just cutting up all our cards and living day to day, because it's not the way our society is really set up. But I want to suggest that this is a place where how we choose to live can, in fact, affect the reality we will encounter. Again, not magically. I don't mean living wantonly as if there will automatically be more than enough, hoping it will just appear. I mean living as if there will, over and over again, be exactly enough. Not so much that we can be wasteful with the resources that are ours to steward, but enough that we can afford to share. When we live out of the belief that there is not enough, that there will never be enough, we have to cling to whatever we can get without stopping to ask whether we really need it, without stopping to ask whether someone else might need it more. If there is never enough, we can never be satisfied. To live with the expectation that there is not more than enough, but just enough, means that when we find that there is more than enough for just us, when we can reasonably guess that tomorrow there will be more than enough for just us, we can open our eyes to see that means there is enough for the next person over. This is a big part of what it means to be a church that serves and loves one another and our community, I think. To ask ourselves regularly, what of our time, what of our talent, what of our money will be just enough today, and to let go of whatever we can beyond that. I've been talking at our stewardship gatherings about the idea of giving away enough of our time, talent, and treasure that we notice what we give away. Not so much that it leaves us without enough, but giving away enough that it requires us to think carefully about how our lives are arranged. The balance for each of us is different. Some of us find it easier to give away money than to find the time to serve at church and in the community, and giving enough that we notice may show up more in money than in time. Some of us find our household budgets crunched, but can make a priority of showing up, and giving enough that we notice may show up more in time and talent than in money. Some of us have a true abundance of money and time and can afford to give larger amounts of both. Some of us have barely enough of both, and every penny and every minute given is one that is noticed. And a church that serves needs the gifts of each one of us, no matter where we find ourselves in this. Ultimately, I hope that as you consider your household arrangements and what you can pledge to the church this fall, you will look for how to give so that you notice it in all areas and not just in one. We can't run a church on just money any more than we can run a church on just talent. It takes all of us and all of our gifts. Scarcity makes us believe that we can do it on our own, and that therefore we have to protect and even hoard what is ours because it's all we will ever have. Enough reminds us that we can afford to be generous with what is ours in the context of a community that will be generous with us in return. And our generosity with one another is part of what builds the community of enoughness. To live as if there will still be enough tomorrow makes room for us to be with the person next to us today. when we can recognize what enough looks like in our hands, then we can let go of it enough for enough to go all the way around the table. In fact, I wonder whether even our regular practice of Holy Communion might not be a part of our training in this kind of enoughness. Communion represents a whole divine feast, and yet all that we get at one time is one bite of the feast for each of us. Such a little bit shouldn't be enough. And yet many of us for whom it's not our first time at God's table would say that somehow that tiny bit has been enough to bring us back to the table again and again. It surprises us sometimes. I wonder, and we can go ahead and go to our slide with the reflection questions now. I wonder, how have you been surprised in the past to discover there was enough when you thought there wouldn't be? And how do you practice stretching yourself to grow in generosity? I invite you to share your answers to this in the chat. Maybe we can start with this first one. Is there a time that you have been surprised to discover there was enough when you thought there wouldn't be? I think this was something I experienced for myself and in watching my students often during finals when I was doing campus ministry and when I was a student, that seemed like there was never going to be enough time to get it all done. And there wasn't, in the sense that if I wanted everything to be absolutely perfect, there probably wasn't enough time for that, but there was always enough time to get it done. If I could set something up to make sure that it all just got done. I wonder if there are ways that you have been surprised. Kellen Vaughn say, new friends, new family, new church, no matter what, where, and when, always God and God's people. Yeah, I think that has been, for those of us who have moved around and done a lot of joining new communities and new churches, I hope we have had experiences there too of enough when we weren't sure whether there would be or not. There are other ways that people have been surprised to discover that there was enough when it seemed like maybe there wouldn't be. Or are there ways that you practice stretching yourself to grow in generosity? Melinda said, I'm a bad party planner. As I always create an abundance of food, I wonder how that speaks to me wanting to ensure there is enough. Ooh, that sounds familiar to me too, Melinda. Deb says, I often look back at my young self and marvel at what I could accomplish in a day in comparison to what I'm capable of today. I have enough today to do what I need to do, but my enough back then was immense. Yeah, that's a great word, Deb, that these things change over time, that what is enough and what we bring to the moment isn't something that is static over time. It changes. I think that can also be part of how we practice stretching ourselves to grow in generosity. Sometimes growing in generosity and that stretch means stretching to say, how can I do whatever I can today, even when it feels like a stretch? And how do I learn my shifting boundaries so that it's always a stretch and not more like a muscle pull, right? That it's not hobbling, it's just stretching. I think one thing that has been helpful for me in stretching myself to grow in generosity is to have little areas of my budget where I say, okay, if I order food on delivery, for instance, then I'm going to take that same amount of money and set aside that amount of money to give away as well. And so, yes, that experience of something that I don't really need is going to cost me twice as much, but it's an opportunity then for me to stretch and grow. Or say, if that's too much of a stretch, then maybe I don't need this thing that I don't need. Maybe enough can be enough with the food that I already have in my house. Callan Vaughn says, celebrating others' sharing of their enough is a blessing to watch and live together. Yes, I think that's a great note to wrap up on. And I invite you to take these questions with you as we continue with our worship and with our week. And as we move now into the affirmation of our faith.